aux nombreux participants qui nous suivent en ligne. Je précise que nous avons l'interprétation en français, anglais et roumain.
Même italien.
Et même italien. Je vais dire quelques mots d'introduction. Cette réunion est dédiée à une question fondamentale, la réduction des émissions dans la filière des produits laitiers. Mais nous ne pouvons pas parler sérieusement de durabilité sans parler de la crise du lait que vivent aujourd'hui nos éleveurs. Car nous ne réussirons pas la transition environnementale si nos agriculteurs n'ont pas un revenu décent. Certains se féliciteront peut-être de voir baisser les émissions parce que des élevages disparaissent. Mais dans ce cas, nous importerons davantage notre alimentation. J'appelle cela mettre la poussière sous le tapis. C'est exactement le type de politique hypocrite contre laquelle je veux me battre. Notre stratégie doit être claire. Maintenir la production en Europe, préserver des élevages compétitifs et rentables et poursuivre la transition environnementale en réduisant les émissions. Les trois objectifs doivent aller ensemble. Quelques chiffres et quelques éléments de contexte pour mesurer les bouleversements que traverse aujourd'hui le secteur laitier. Il est important que la Commission européenne, qui participe à nos travaux, prenne pleinement la mesure du problème. Le prix du lait vient de tomber à 35 centimes le litre, alors qu'il était encore à 55 centimes il y a quelques mois. Nous retrouvons des niveaux de prix comparables à ceux de la crise de 2015, il y a plus de 10 ans. Mais entre-temps, tous les coûts ont explosé. Les études montrent que les charges dans une exploitation laitière ont augmenté de 18% en 10 ans. Le contexte mondial, lui aussi, a profondément changé. Pendant des décennies, les marchés laitiers mondiaux obéissaient à une règle simple. Quand la Chine achetait plus, les prix montaient partout ailleurs. En tant que premier importateur mondial de poudre de lait, la demande chinoise dictait les revenus des producteurs en Nouvelle-Zélande, dans l'Union européenne, aux États-Unis et en Australie. Le moindre ralentissement des achats chinois faisait immédiatement vaciller les marchés mondiaux. Cette règle aujourd'hui est en train de disparaître. L'expansion rapide du secteur laitier en Chine l'a transformé du plus grand importateur mondial en producteur excédentaire et exportateur émergent. Sa production de lait cru est passée d'environ 31 millions de tonnes en 2018 à plus de 41 millions en 2023, réduisant fortement ses besoins d'importation. Par exemple, ses achats de poudre de lait entier ont chuté de près de 40% depuis 2021. À cela s'ajoutent des conditions climatiques très favorables dans la plupart des grandes régions productrices. Une analyse de Rabobank montre que la météo favorable dans l'Union européenne, aux États-Unis, en Nouvelle-Zélande et en Amérique du Sud a soutenu une hausse mondiale de la production supérieure à 2% en 2025, bien au-delà de ce que les marchés peuvent absorber. Bref, nous sommes en face de ce que l'on appelait une véritable tempête parfaite. Le prix du beurre est tombé autour de 5 000 € la tonne, alors qu'il était de plus ou moins 8 000 en 2024, entraînant mécaniquement la baisse du prix du lait qui pourrait encore continuer. Je crains que nous n'ayons pas encore atteint le point bas. Dès lors, la question centrale que nous devons nous poser est la suivante. Peut-on réduire davantage les émissions sans détruire la compétitivité de nos élevages? Et surtout, qui va payer? Car nous le savons, l'innovation et la technologie ont un coût élevé. Avant de lancer le débat, je vous propose de regarder une courte vidéo de 3 minutes pour laquelle, je m'excuse, il n'y aura pas d'interprétation.
A charming landscape, or instead a scene of greenhouse gas production causing global warming?
There are 280 million dairy cows across all continents. Many are in advanced technology production centers. Here, for instance, cows in a mid-sized German company are on their way to high-tech milking machines. There are 133 million well-qualified dairy farmers around the world. They ensure that cattle farming makes an important contribution to feeding our global population, nearly 8 billion people, with valuable meat and dairy products.
Long shelves in supermarkets are filled with milk and hundreds of dairy products. Cheese, for instance, comes in so many varieties from all continents and for thousands of years.
Chinese ice cream, following a 1,400-year-old recipe. An Ethiopian butter gourd. And what would an Indian marketplace be without delicious lassi yogurt?
Cows coming home in Germany. Animals and people in a cultural and nutritional symbiosis. Should all this age-old cultural wisdom now be called into question because the cows are being made responsible for climate change? Children drinking milk in school. Milk plays such an important role in nutrition that in 2001, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, introduced the World School Milk Day. More than 40 countries participate. At McMaster University in Canada, Professor Andrew Mente is researching the health benefits of milk consumption. The globally organized Pure Research Project involves 135,000 people from all socio-cultural backgrounds of the world. Its results are clear.
So higher dairy consumption, particularly whole-fat dairy, is associated with a lower risk of mortality and cardiovascular disease, particularly a lower risk of stroke.
Nonetheless, in Germany, the public TV stations ARD and ZDF warn against milk because of climate change. Here excerpts made for a target group of 14 to 29-year-olds.
Milk has a relevant impact on our climate. Even though the CO2 emissions of dairy production have decreased since 1990, the dairy industry is still responsible for 3% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, more than all the airplanes in the world.
Plenty of milk means many cows. And those cows are heating up the climate of our planet, so we're told. The cows emit lots of methane, and that methane is hurting our climate. There is an increasing amount of discussion on how we can reduce our meat and milk consumption. Meat and milk taxes are considered, or even bans are requested. But how are cows and climate really related?
The satellite pictures of the European Space Agency ESA help to find answers. They show where there is methane in the atmosphere. Red is more, blue is less methane.
Leaky gas pipelines in Russia are easy to spot. And in China, a lot of coal and oil is burned, causing methane emissions.
However, in Brazil, where 212 million animals amount to the largest cattle herd in the world, there are no heightened methane concentrations visible from space.
The same is true for Ethiopia and Sudan, where a total of 96 million cattle are kept, more than all of the European Union.
But regardless of where they are in the world, cows are part of an air, soil, grass animal system. To understand the system, it is necessary to study the related physical, chemical, and biological processes. A natural part of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, CO2, consisting of 1 carbon and 2 oxygen atoms. Its share of the atmosphere is 0.04%. All plants, including grasses, depend on this CO2 for their growth and take it from the air. From the soil, the plants take water, H2O, consisting of 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen atoms. From these, plants create long carbon chains. Through reactions with other elements, these become sugars, fats, and proteins. Ruminants, for instance cows, eat these grasses and so take in the sugars, fats, and proteins. And with them, they produce the milk in their udders. Humans eat these carbon chains in the form of milk and dairy products.
Voilà, merci beaucoup à Stéphane Keller qui a rejoint nos travaux ce matin. Stéphane, petite réaction en attendant que notre orateur arrive dans la salle.
Yeah, thank you, Bernard, and thank you for the organization of this event. And I'm really impressed about the video because we have seen that in Germany there is quite a campaign against cattle and especially dairy farming. And the climate discussion is going to be used to blame the animals. But on the other side, and that's very important too in that video, but you just paused it, that it's a natural cycle. And photosynthesis, if you learned agriculture, you know that this is the heart of agriculture production, that this is a natural cycle. And in Bavaria, we always say it's a green carbon and a black carbon. And in the discussion, we totally forgot the black carbon. That's fuel, that's emission by the traffic, by heating systems. And we shouldn't blame the animals because we need also food to survive because we cannot use grass. And especially in Bavaria, where I come from, you have seen the nice traditional work with the cows. We need the cows to have the very important biodiversity, especially in the areas where you just can use the fields as grass. And the difficult discussion that we are eating or producing too much food for the animals is totally wrong, because we have also to deliver or use grass to produce high quality protein, and therefore you need a cattle. That's why God made it in this way, and we shouldn't blame cattle for the climate.
Thank you very much, Stéphane. Valérie, ta réaction?
Merci, Monsieur Cassard. Eh bien, écoutez, chers participants et puis chers collègues, mon point de vue sera surtout sur l'idée du méthane, climat, élevage bovin. Et je pense qu'on va un peu tous dans le même sens. On entend très souvent parler que les vaches détruisent le climat, et cette affirmation est scientifiquement simpliste. Oui, les bovins émettent du méthane, mais il faut rappeler aussi une réalité fondamentale, c'est qu'en premier, le méthane issu des vaches s'inscrit dans un cycle de carbone court. Il se dégrade en une dizaine d'années. Il provient de carbone issu capté par l'herbe via la photosynthèse. Donc on ne parle pas ici évidemment de carbone fossile extrait du sol et rajouté durablement donc à l'atmosphère. Assimiler l'élevage herbagé et les énergies fossiles est donc une erreur scientifique. En deuxième point, je voulais dire qu'en fin de compte, en France, l'élevage bovin maintient nos prairies permanentes. Ces prairies stockent le carbone dans les sols, préservent la biodiversité et limitent l'érosion et régulent l'eau. Parce que s'il y a une prairie, ça veut dire qu'il y a aussi des haies. S'il n'y a pas de prairie, il n'y a plus de haies. Et donc, c'est fini au niveau de la biodiversité. Si on supprime les vaches, ces prairies vont donc disparaître et vont être retournées, relâchant évidemment le carbone stocké. Donc, troisièmement, à peu près 80 à 90% de l'alimentation des ruminants n'est pas consommable par l'homme. Ces bovins transforment l'herbe et donc les coproduits de protéines de haute valeur nutritionnelle. Ils ne concurrencent donc pas l'alimentation humaine, ils la complètent. Et enfin, les émissions européennes par kilo de viande ou de litre de lait ont baissé grâce au progrès génétique et à l'amélioration des rations et à la gestion des effluents. Supprimer l'élevage ne réduira pas la consommation, cela déplacera simplement la production vers les pays moins exigeants sur le plan environnemental. La question est donc de savoir si moins de vaches, mais quel type d'élevage voulons-nous ? Un élevage herbacé extensif et territorial intégré dans le système durable ou une dépendance accrue aux importations issues de la déforestation. Et je le dis souvent, si nous ne produisons pas ici, en fin de compte, on le produit ailleurs et le CO2, lui, fait le tour du monde. Donc, est-ce que opposer les vaches au climat est une erreur scientifique ? Enfin, opposer les vaches au climat est donc une erreur scientifique et aussi une faute politique. Les ruminants ne sont pas le problème, ils font partie de la solution, à condition de défendre l'élevage herbacé, ancré dans nos territoires et respectueux des équilibres naturels. Donc, nous avons besoin de l'élevage de bovins sur nos territoires pour assurer aussi notre sécurité alimentaire. Voilà, je vous remercie beaucoup.
So let me hand over now to Professor Pinotti from the Department of Veterinary Medicine and Animal Health from the University of Milan. Professor, you're going to be telling us about your viewpoint on the important issue that we are tackling today. Thank you very much, Professor. Over to you.
So, good morning to everybody, and thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and contribute to this discussion. So, I have a presentation in which I try to summarize some aspect. Of course, some topic has been touched also in the video that we have seen. But in order to start, I would like to remind, the next please, some key figures which, the next please, okay, which underline the relevance of dairy, milk and dairy in our diet. These data are referred to the Western diet or European diet, in which you can see milk is extremely important. Next please. But we have to consider that milk is not just a source of nutrients. We have to consider that these nutrients are extremely bioavailable and bioaccessible. So it's not just a matter of quantity, but how these ingredients or these components are available for humans. Please go ahead. Next, okay. And it is clear when we look at the digestibility of this material, of this component, and as well as the opportunity, next please, that milk offers in order to produce also some specific supplements. I put here just some example about supplement for bodybuilders or milk fat globule membrane for infant formula or lactoferrin and so on. Go ahead, please. But talking about Europe and a little bit about efficiency, I would like to put your attention here, because here is the ratio between the amount of feedstuff, including forages, that we need for producing our farm food of animal origin in Europe. And if we look also the food produced, so meat, milk, eggs, and whatever, and you make a ratio about this figure, you can see, next please, that the gross feed conversion ratio is quite low, 2.38. It's a gross feed conversion rate. But if, next please, we go to milk and milk production, next please, it is clear that the scenario is even better because we are able to produce 1 kilogram of milk using less than 1 kilogram of feed. And this indicated that our European system is for sure an advanced system, a mature system. And as many people said here before me, we have to preserve this kind of production in Europe. Next, please. Again. So, which are the main drivers of these improvements? Of course, genetics, but my colleagues will tell you later on. And of course, other aspects like nutrition, which is the main environmental factor which may affect the animal response, and also other management. We have seen in the video how nowadays the cow, we take care of the cow in terms of welfare and whatever. Next, please. But focusing our attention on nutrition, here I reported just the evolution that we have about nutrition. Next, please. In which, as you can see, next, we implement a lot the quality and the refinement of the diet for our cows. So especially with micronutrients and so on, because they are extremely efficient and so on. So grass and silage and so on, so what forages are essential, but nowadays we put in the diet of this cow in order to guarantee a high production and also the health of the animal, a lot of micronutrients which are extremely important, especially for cows which are producing so much. Next, please. But of course, as we heard before, we know very well that the cow as a ruminant can produce methane in its physiological digestive system. Next, please. Accordingly, nowadays there is a debate, as we heard, about methane and whatever, but ruminant has an impact, a big impact. We heard previously some data that are correct, but we have also to keep in mind that dairy cow and ruminant in general are able to use something which is not consumed by humans. So there is no competition between this kind of animal with humans. This is essential that we have to keep in mind. But please pay attention to the last point in this slide. You see up 12% of the dietary energy is lost as methane. Well, this is a key element because historically, nutritionists, animal scientists are paying attention in reducing this output because it's important for the efficiency of the animal. And furthermore, just a few data, next please, about what happened in Europe in terms of emission. The green bar represents the output or the emission of methane for agricultural sector. Go ahead, please. Both. And again, and as you can see here, when we, next please, when we talk about the emission from a system like the European one, which is really advanced and mature, the contribution is extremely low. And these figures are extremely important when there is a debate about the European sector. However, next please, we know that the methane is an issue for the society and so on. Therefore, next please, as a scientist or as a scientific community, we put a lot of effort during the last year in investigating which solution we can put in place in order to reduce methane emission. This graph shows in Web of Science how many papers has been delivered or published about dairy referred to methane emission. So the trend is extremely positive. Go ahead, please. Also, I'm a former president of a nutrition commission or EAP, and now I'm vice-president actually. And as you can see here, I put these two books of abstracts. Why? Because during the last 2 years, next please, we address methane with many contributions from all of Europe and beyond. And this indicates that the scientific community is paying a lot of attention to this topic. And in the bottom part is also reported a conference which is joint with the American Society of Animal Science that will be next April, focused specifically on that. Go ahead, please. So, but what we can put in place or what we have ready to use for reducing methane via nutrition in dairy cattle. We have many options. And of course, the maturity of these options are not the same. Go ahead, please. So everybody knows that we have a feed additive registered with a claim. So this is a key aspect that we have to underline because it means that this has been proved, and which is NOP. NOP, go ahead, please. Work well in reducing methane emission. This is a very recent work published by Wageningen University. Go ahead, please. In which you see the adoption of this additive is able to reduce the emission of methane. Go ahead, please. I put also this slide, which is a meta-analysis covering the same additive in different studies. Why I put this? Because as you can see, it's not easy for who is not familiar to meta-analysis, but you see not all the study reported the same response. Why? Because, of course, according to what the animal eat, the environment in which they are based, and furtherly, also if the rate of passage of the dry matter through the animal and so on, there are many variables which may affect the response. However, in all the cases, these additives works. And what we learn from this meta-analysis is, next please, is that, of course, if according to the component of the diet, the response can be higher or lower, but in general, it works. Go ahead, please. We have, go ahead, please. We have other options, like algae, nitrates are two options. But of course, in this case, we are in a scenario a little bit different, because in order to prove their activity, and especially to guarantee that they can work in different scenarios, in different farm or herds, of course, we need to investigate more deeply this material, especially because we are talking about material that are coming from nature, and accordingly, we have some variables more than something which is produced industrially. Go ahead, please. The same for this option, using lipids, plant secondary compound like tannins and so on, or essential oils. The same here. We are working in order to understand which is better, or what is, which kind of processing we have to adopt, especially for tannins and whatever, to guarantee an effect and to put on a claim eventually for future new additive and so on. Go ahead, please. So the last option is also to work on what the animal eat, because feed additives are added in a small quantity, and also the intervention that I offer to you are 1, 2, or less, 1-2% in the dry matter content. But we have to work also on the complete diet. We are working in this direction. Grass, hay, and whatever has been already mentioned by previous speaker. And of course, we are trying to design a perfect, or something which is good, in terms of reduction of methane, but at the same time to guarantee an environmental sustainability of the livestock production system, and especially the dairy one. Go ahead, please. Well, this is my last slide. Of course, if you, I put this because society and policymakers, of course, are intimately linked, but the third aspect is research, because we are here to support the policymaker and also to society with scientific-based information and solution when possible. And as you can see here, starting from 60 until now, the scenario changes every time. So at the beginning, the main topic was food security, and then quality, and then safety. Nowadays, we are talking a lot. Sustainability, it is an abused word, actually. But we have to keep in mind this. So in my opinion, it is important also for another reason. Next, please. Because nowadays we are suffering, or we have in the middle of several crises around the globe and also in Europe. Therefore, to have a little bit food security is a little bit back. So to produce our food of animal origin locally in Europe is a key aspect that must be preserved when possible. Thank you. This is all for me.
Merci beaucoup, professeur. J'ai une petite question pour vous.
Thank you. I have a question for you on new additives. We have tabled a question to the Commission on looking at the regulation on additives to incorporate innovation. We've heard a lot of criticism of additives in Denmark, concerns about the health of cows. What is your thinking here?
So feed additives are essential nowadays for a modern livestock production system. And I start from a basic assumption. When an additive is approved by the European law, it means that it is safe. Accordingly, of course, we need long-term studies, which also are provided in the dossier for the approval. So, in my opinion, what we have nowadays for some feed additives, and one actually, should be considered safe, and therefore our effort should be how to improve its use or refine this additive in order to make it better, safer, and whatever. So we need a starting point. And in my opinion, what we have in terms of feed additives nowadays is a very good starting point, not only for Europe, but around the globe.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Now I give the floor to Professor Per Ederer, qui est arrivé.
Over to you, sir.
Here for several times already. Thank you for your contribution here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me. We cannot repeat the messages frequently enough. Unfortunately, this morning, without warning, Lufthansa personnel decided to go on strike, with the result that traffic in Germany has essentially broken down. But I'm here. I understand you already watched the first 4 minutes of the video that we have created 6 years ago by now. We released it in January 2020. Now, if you want to watch the complete video, you would be able to see it under the website www.milkandclimate.com if the website was not shadow banned by Google. So I think this already tells you part of the problem. You can still find the video under milchundklima.de, and then you can go on the English version. So when we're talking about cows and dairy, we need to get to the scientific evidence, because too much of the debate is dominated by ideology and by misrepresentation of the facts. As my co-speakers have said and will say, nobody is denying that ruminants and producing dairy are emitting methane. Nobody is denying that this is a substantial portion of the methane budget. Nobody is denying that methane is a very active greenhouse gas. So absolutely, we need to work on reducing the methane emissions of the cows. As my previous co-speaker has already explained, science is working very hard at it. Not only science, but also the companies, the dairy companies. The entire value chain is working very hard on reducing the methane emissions. And once you put your attention on something, you will reduce it. Innovation is an amazing tool. If you let an innovation happening, then you will reduce the problem that you have. And we will be reducing methane emissions substantially. What I want to emphasize here is that besides the methane emissions, the entire debate on cows always focuses on the liability of the cow. It does not focus on the assets of the cow. So let's be sure, ruminants are still the only large-scale technology that we have available in the world in order to achieve substantial carbon sequestration. Let's also be sure that ruminants are the only technology, large-scale technology that we have in order to preserve the biodiversity of grasslands. And grasslands are fundamentally, elementally important for a balanced ecosystem. And let's also be clear, and that's where I want to highlight a couple of the charts that have already shown in Brussels, but I think it deserves to be shown again, a few charts on how vitally important dairy culture is, dairy is to any nutritional impact from a public health point of view to society. especially here in Europe. Other cultures in the world have built their nutritional system around other foodstuffs, especially in Far East. Dairy has a less prominent role, but here in the European food system, dairy has a nearly irreplaceable function to achieve healthy nutrition and affordable nutrition for the European population. To be targeting the dairy cow herd of Europe for reduction so that we can meet climate change goals, so that the transport and the automotive and the industrial sector can delay their climate change adaptation by years and decades, is fundamentally irresponsible because we're playing with the health of the European population. So besides carbon sequestration, besides biodiversity protection, besides the protection of the water tables, I want to illustrate once more why dairy is so fundamentally important to the public health of the European population. I have a handful of charts. I will quickly go through them. If I could see, please, the next one. So in Europe, a typical European citizen on average spends €7.50 per day on household food. Roughly 40% of that is on animal-sourced foods. All of these analyses are based on Eurostat data. They are not exclusive. They're just sort of analyzed in a way that makes it accessible for us. Now, out of that €7.50, roughly €1, that's this white bar there in the middle, €1 is spent on milk, cheese, and eggs. Eggs is negligible. Most of that is milk and cheese. Next chart, please. So those animal-sourced foods, of which we're spending 40% of the budget on across Europe, they are essential for the protein supply in European diets. What you're seeing here is that the European citizen on average receives about 110 grams of protein per day, and they absolutely must receive that. Not all of that ends in the stomach. There is always an oversupply. There is always food waste issues and that we cannot avoid. So in order to achieve the minimum supply of proteins that a healthy European person needs to have, we need those 100 to 110 grams of protein per day available to European citizens. And as you can see on the legend, most of that, roughly 80% of that, derives from animal source foods. So meat, dairy, eggs, and fish. And this big yellow blob in the center of this chart, that is dairy. You can see that dairy products in the European diet dominate, are the largest contributor of proteins and micronutrients, minerals, and vitamins to the European diet. Next chart, please. So this is similar among the high-income peer group of the world. The Americans consume less dairy than the Europeans, so the American discussion is a little bit different. But on the right side, you see that the entire Western European peer group, compared to Germany as an example where I started, essentially has dairy at the center of their micronutrient provision. Next chart, please. So if you look at on a bioavailability protein supply, the picture becomes even more important. So what does the protein supply cost? It costs €5.60 per day per capita, as an example, in Germany. And again, half of that roughly on an adjusted proteins per day basis. Now, what is adjusted? Adjusted for bioavailability, because milk products and meat products have a higher bioavailability than micronutrients and proteins, iron from plant-based sources. So if we look at the 95 grams per bioavailable proteins, then we spend 5.62 on that. But you can see, if you compare the left chart with the right chart on the left side, roughly half of the bioavailable proteins come from milk, but on the right side, where you see what it costs, you can observe that it's only 20% of the cost. Next chart, please. So here is the cost in terms of protein. And you can see that fruits, vegetables, and potatoes are a very important food source. I don't want to speak against fruits, vegetables, and potatoes. We do not eat enough of them in Europe. We need to eat more of them. But in terms of protein and micronutrient supply, they are very expensive. Bread and cereals, in terms of milk and micronutrient supply, they are 5 times more expensive than dairy. Fish, meat, and at the bottom you see milk, cheese, and eggs at 26 euros. Where's the chart? Yeah, so 26 euros per kilo of protein. Milk is the almost cheapest source of micronutrient supply to the European population. Next chart, please. So we can also see that across the entire European Union, from Ireland at the left all the way to Slovakia on the right. And what you can see is that the milk price in terms of protein is more or less same for every European Union citizen. That in itself is a big achievement, that the dairy products are available to the European Union citizens at affordable prices, and we need to protect that important public good. Next chart. So all of this is available and more data in this report that we have released on November 25. It's not quite true. It hasn't been released in the public yet, but we are hoping to release it after final reviews in March of next month. And there you can find even more details on what it costs to provide healthy, nourishing food to the European Union population, and the important role of animal-sourced foods and dairy in particular for this. Next chart. Next chart. This chart here from the FAO has already been circulated many times. I don't need to repeat it once more. The key message from this chart is dietary change in Europe is not the pathway to prevent to achieve climate protection in Europe. So let's put the cow where it belongs. Let's work on the methane reductions that are possible, but let's not have a fight, let's not have a debate that is actually fundamentally, scientifically wrong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would like now welcome my colleague Herbert Dorfmann, who is Agri Coordinator for EPP. Herbert, do you have some comments about?
Yeah, I think, thank you very much for the presentation, very interesting. I actually have 1 or 2 questions, but some of us observation, I think, and I agree with you, this whole debate about not only methane, also CO2 is very often a silo debate. What I mean by this, we look at the animal and we look at the emission of the animal, but we don't look at the whole circle. So we don't look what does this animal eat, what happens on the field where the feed is produced, and what is the whole CO2 or methane circle of all of this. And therefore, I think it's fundamentally wrong if somebody says a kilo of beef or a liter of milk has a CO2 emission or methane emission of X, because it depends on what happens. And I give you just an example. I'm coming from a region where more or less 2/3 of the land used by farmers are alpine pastures. So there's no alternative to permanent grassland. And if I add to this alpine pastures the permanent grassland, we are above 85% of the land. So all this land without animals becomes completely useless. because on an alpine pasture in 2,500 meters, I cannot put sugar beets or vineyards. It's impossible. And if I look at this alpine pasture and I see what happens if ruminants are not there, photosynthesis go to zero because no grass is growing anymore. The grass needs to be used to regrow. And I think we have to open a bit the debate to a whole cycle calculation, not only seeing the animal as itself. But my question would rather, or I have two questions. You mentioned additives. Asking myself why a farmer should use additives. What is the added value? They have a cost, and this cost is not rewarded normally. So how can we also politically incentivize the use of these additives? Because otherwise I fear the farmers will not use it, because it doesn't give them any added value. If his cow or he emits a bit more or less methane, the farmer doesn't care a lot, cares about the economy in his production. So how can we do this, or do you have any idea how we could incentivize this, or should we leave this rather to the dairies? And you mentioned big cooperatives insisting on their CO2 and methane footprint. And the second question, you didn't mention breeding and the possibility of breeding. How do you see this to achieve through breeding animals which emit less? Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Herbert.
Thank you, Herbert.
So this chart by FAO, which I did not explain, but this chart is so fantastic and it has become so famous because it touches on all the different levers that we have. We have breeding, we have genetic breeding opportunities, we have feeding opportunities, we have feed additive opportunities, we have housing opportunities, so we have many different opportunities. There is not only one technology that saves everything. So additives is one part and many other levers. So we have many different technologies. And something that we always need to get right. An alpine meadow in Austria or in Switzerland where I live has a different biosystem and therefore needs a different approach. And a cow that lives in Italy, a cow that lives in Denmark, a cow that lives in Spain, we need localized, individualized solutions to optimize performance between affordability, sustainability, and nutritional food security. And the best way to achieve that optimization is through market mechanisms rather than bureaucratic impositions, because bureaucratic impositions will always get it suboptimal.
Professor Pinotti, perhaps a reaction of...
So, with my colleague, actually, what is important is to adapt the solution according to the system or the local system that we have. And about additives, of course, the role of science is to provide solution. It's different to, I'm not going, or my idea is not to impose nothing. It is important to make free the people and the farmer to adopt or not a solution. But of course, here there is other players because sometimes the farmers are obliged to pay attention to this aspect about methane due to the fact that they have to sell also the milk and so on. So again, we need an approach which is more holistic, which combine not only the primary production, but also the subsequent steps of the chain.
Okay, merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I'll now give the floor to Professor Marcin Petzola from Poznan University in Poland. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today. Over to you now for 10 minutes.
I'm glad that breeding was mentioned because that's what I'm going to talk about. Well, breeding is a part of the solution, and I'd like to present that to you based on our research and research from my colleagues, many colleagues from Europe. So next slide, please. And first of all, we need to know, as Professor Pinotti mentioned, that no one in animal breeding denies the climate change, and that we, as a human activities, we do have an impact on the climate change. Next slide, please. But when we look at the situation on emissions in different sectors, and here are the statistics from Poland. Next slide, please. Then we can see that there are areas that cause much bigger problems to the environment than dairy. 3% was mentioned already. But still, since we are working a lot on that issue, we, as Animal Breeding Society or scientists from that part of the discipline, we do acknowledge that we have to do something to reduce emissions. Next slide, please. And that's one reason is, of course, to save the environment, to lower the impact. Next slide, please. But the second one is more down to earth because, as it was mentioned as well, 2 to 12% of energy is lost that is provided to cows from feed when methane is produced. So there is also economic incentive for the farmers to reduce methane emission. Next slide, please. So we have different ways to reduce methane emissions, and nutrition was mentioned. The manure management is also an important aspect that has to be taken care of. But I'm animal breeder, animal geneticist, so I'm going to focus on the third part, which is, next slide, please, improvement through selective breeding. So how we can achieve that to reduce emissions through breeding. And actually, there are many ways in which we can do that, direct ways and indirect ways. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see the increase in milk production over the decades in Poland. So you can see that the average milk production per lactation per year increased substantially. And that's through improved feeding, but mainly through improved breeding. And you can see that the increase happens over the years slowly, but constantly. So after 20 years, we have increased milk production by far. And it has to be remembered that the more cow is producing and the more efficient the cow is, it means that she will emit less per kilogram of milk that she produces, right? So by increasing the milk production, we as farmers and breeding societies already have increased or decreased the methane emissions. So that's one important fact to have in mind, that we as a breeders already are taking actions to lower emissions, which is driven by economic of the production. Next slide, please. Also, well, cow produce milk from first lactation, and there's a certain period of life in which the cow eats and produces methane, but does not produce milk. And also, if we keep cows to live longer, and we do select for longevity of cows, we also are taking actions from economic point of view for the farmers, because cows that live longer in the herd are more efficient, economically efficient. But also, through the whole period of life, the cow will produce less intensity of methane emissions. So more milk divided by the same amount of methane, it turns out to be less intense emissions per cow. Next slide, please. And of course, there are many aspects that we want to cover. Also, improving directly feed efficiency. So there are also ways to improve efficiency. As I said before, more efficient cows in terms of production produce less methane. Next slide, please. There are tools available for the farmers. Example from the UK, there is an EnviroCow index, which includes different traits like feed advantage, that's the feed efficiency trait, production lifespan, which is longevity, and fertility. If we improve those by 1 point, so if we, there's this index is presented on a scale, and if we improve that by 1 point, it means less CO2, well, 10% less CO2 per cow, which is produced. So that's a tool that farmers can use to reduce methanes indirectly. Next slide, please. But there are also other ways. We can actually measure emissions from cows. That's a slide from our experiment in Poznań, but many other European universities and also breeding companies starting to use those outcomes of those experiments. We actually can measure methane concentration from the cows. That's a cow milked in the milking robot. And based on that, we can evaluate each animal in terms of how much methane is she producing. Next slide, please. And our research and research from our colleagues showed that this is a heritable trait. And heritable trait means that it can be improved by breeding because it is inherited in part to the next generation. The most part is the environment and nutrition, 80%, but 20% of the differences between cows that we can see is due to genetics. So we certainly can improve that by breeding. Next slide, please. Our study were able to localize particular genes that are responsible for methane emissions. So this gives a hope that what we found is real effect of genetic effect and not just the artifact of the data that we've collected. Next slide, please. And when you think of what can be achieved with breeding with direct methane emission, because if we select for direct trait, that's the most impactful way to select. And if you look at the chart, there are two scenarios that we can reduce methane emission by 1% per year or 3%. And you can see the decrease in methane emission by multiple percentages over the years, at faster or lower rate. But it is important to remember that if we change something through breeding, with genetics, that this potential stays in the next generation, and you can build up, so you can reduce based on what have been reduced in the past generation. So that's a very powerful tool. You've seen the increase of milk production. You can imagine what can be done with that, with methane. Next, please. And well, some countries already have ways in which the farmers can select directly for methane emissions, for lower methane emission. Canada, Spain, the Netherlands, they publish breeding values on the direct methane emissions, and the farmers can select animals that are more friendly to the environment. Next, please. And there are global initiatives that are enabling the improvement or increase of the selection measuring procedure, because we have to measure methane from the many cows in order to run breeding programs. Next slide, please. So this is an example of global methane genetics initiative that is co-founded by Bezos Earth Fund, and it is led by Wageningen University. And you can see how many countries, partners, and breeds are involved in this action. Next slide, please. And Poland and Italy, in a partnership, there is a separate project in which we are buying equipments to measure, and it's actually not by the scientists, it's actually by the federations of cattle breeders. So the industry is adopting that technology, and the seed money that are given from the program help us to start the measuring process. And that's just the beginning, but once the infrastructure is set up, then we can measure and start to breed for lower emitting cows. Next, please. So what is happening actually within the breeding is important to say that we are already, or the farmers are already making a progress towards reduced methane emission. And then there is more to come in terms of direct selection, but the project, the local projects are the seed projects, so there has to be incentive for the farmers or encouragement for the farmers, also in terms of the running those initiatives longer to sustain the measuring systems and to make the progress available for the bigger populations. And actually, those data from Poland, Italy, and other countries, they will be joined together. So there's a world joint effort to reduce methane emission, which is now supported by the private initiative, and I believe it could be supported by or European initiatives or by some kind of incentives for the farmers. And thank you for attention. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I have just a quick question. When you speak about the variability genetics, it's inside the Holstein, of you have made the comparison between different breeding?
So our study focused on Holstein because that's the main breed in Poland and many studies. But within this project, there are many breeds included, brown Swiss and all Danish cows as well. So there will be a comparison between different breeds. There are differences in terms of methane emission across breeds. Some are, but also sometimes this is coupled with production status. So that has to be still developed to the fair comparison that requires the measurements. But yes, there is a potential of crossing, for example, to reduce methane, but that's not commonly done in dairy sector. That might be solution for beef, more at hand, but in dairy that has to be carefully considered in terms of production and efficiency.
Merci beaucoup. En tout cas, c'est très intéressant.
Thank you very much. In any event, that's certainly very interesting and gives us an interesting food for thought. I'm very pleased to welcome our colleague from Luxembourg, Charles Goerens, who was also a farmer for a long time. Welcome. And I will now give the floor to another fellow farmer, Ludovic Blin, a dairy producer in France and a member of the board of the CNIEL, the French Interprofessional Centre of the Dairy Economy. Ludovic, over to you for 10 minutes.
Bien. Donc,
Well, good morning to all. Well, yes, you mentioned CNIEL, the Interprofessional Centre, which represents the various value chains of the dairy sector, right up to retail and working also with dairy businesses. So I'm Ludovic Blin. I'm a dairy producer in Normandy, in the Manche area. There are 6 of us working on the dairy farm. We have 250 dairy cows. Well, it goes without saying that this is certainly an important issue, so I'd like to thank you for having invited the CNIEL. Thank you very much for inviting us to participate here today, to feed into this discussion with our perspective on this important issue, which is, of course, trying to reduce the impact of emissions. And just to give you a bit of background information, agriculture does, of course, contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, 12%. And so when you look at livestock farming, well, that represents about 60% of that share of greenhouse gas emissions. What was that?
Exactement. Voilà. 60...
Comments off mic. Yes, quite right. 60% of those greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture come specifically from livestock farming. So that is significant, and there are things that we can do. So what's France doing? Well, since 2015, we have been working on a low-carbon approach. And it's important to point out here that from 1990 to 2019, we have seen a drop in emissions, around 20% in the livestock farming industry. So as I was saying, that's the approach that we're using in France. And this is made possible through a specific measure, enabling farmers to limit the impact that their farms have on the environment. Cap 2R is the name of the measure. So there are several steps to this process. There is a first environmental diagnosis, if you will, and the aim of that is really to measure the impact that dairy farmers have in terms of emissions. At this step, it's about quantifying. We measure in CO2 equivalent kilograms, look at what comes from dairy production, The French average sits at around 0.85 kilos of CO2 per litre of milk produced. And when that assessment step is carried out, the diagnosis, you then put into place an action plan to try and improve things. So obviously I implemented this measure on my own farm, and at that diagnosis stage, the assessment, I wasn't doing very well, to be honest. I was just above 1.5 per litre of milk produced. So the next stage was to set up an action plan to try and reduce the emissions on my farm specifically. I'm going to talk a little bit about those measures to reduce the emissions now. And that's really helped us in this aim. Several different approaches as part of this. We need to make sure that your animals are productive. That's got to do with ensuring that the livestock live as long as possible. And that's the right way to go about things. Now, there is still progress to be made in terms of feed. We're looking at protein intake, pulses that can help in reducing emissions. In addition to this, we want to make sure that we can work as well as possible, and we're looking at grass, planting more grass in the farm, increasing the surface area. That leads to more protein, but this is also obviously quite a useful carbon storage measure. There are other ways that we go about this as well. Some of them are a little more technical. No, it's about ensuring that there is a proper place to stock manure so that you reduce the evaporation of gases. That's very important. So we cover that. Methanization as well is something that we work on. We're a dairy farm. Methane is significant, around 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. So as I was saying earlier, nutrition is one way we have a working on this. The rationing techniques, my colleagues have already touched on this, but that's something else that we're working on. Now, I did hear something about feed additives. Science obviously has a role to play in this. We need to let science do its work to provide guarantees. Sometimes this has got to do with commercial interests. Some are really eager to speed ahead on some of these measures. Our request is to let science do its work on this, to give it the right amount of time, to make sure that we really have a good understanding of what all of this is going to mean. It's about doing things at the right pace. There are other techniques as well when it comes to genetics. That's an important lever too. In looking at some of these different approaches in genetics, you can breed animals that produce less methane, and there are other issues as well that we're looking into. Europe needs to move forward on NGTs, on new genomic techniques. All of this is going to lead to simplification. It means that we're spending less time out on the land, which means that there's less CO2, and our crops have to evolve to try and respond to that challenge as well, in looking at that aspect of it. In terms of what I do, I said I was at 1.5, and I've managed to reduce my emissions down to the average in France of 0.85%. I'm using less soy from outside the European Union. Instead, I use protein that's produced in France. And this is also an area where progress has to be made, where Europe really has to make an effort to try and limit that dependency that we have on protein that's been imported. 30% of protein is still imported, and it is my view that we really need to encourage increased protein production here in the EU. I've tried to get my animals to live longer as well. That's another important way of taking action. Then there's the matter of methanization. That's been of some significance as well. We've certainly seen a great impact there. So you can see there are a few different elements that come into play here. Really, this is about having a holistic view. Breeding is important to our communities. It's got to do with the economic fabric of our communities. In regions where you see breeding, well, that means that you have economically viable areas. Then in terms of the environment, well, breeding can actually have a positive impact in terms of the climate crisis. It's quite important to note that when you are in areas where there is breeding, there's a high quantity of organic matter, you have water stocks, and then you have animal fodder, feed that actually grows better in a more productive way. There are some areas in France where livestock breeding is just not happening anymore, and crops are really struggling because of that. As I was saying, this is really about having a holistic view of the situation. There are three main challenges that we face in the dairy sector. Looking at the world markets, well, demand is on the rise, which means we're going to have to produce more. But more importantly, we're going to have to produce better in the face of the impact of climate change. We can't pretend it's not happening. We need to work on decarbonisation, producing more, producing better. That's certainly very important. And that will also help us to tackle the third challenge, which is the attractiveness of this profession to young people. When we're able to shed light on what's actually happening with breeding and with the climate, well, that's something that young people are certainly very sensitive to, and that will enable us to make progress. So what do we need from the EU? Well, we need support from the EU. We need support in the green transition. That support really needs to be there in the shape of investment, investing in technology, on genetics, which we touched on earlier. And we need to make sure, too, that our farms are supported with the right kind of funding that will contribute to lessening impact, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's all from me. If you have any questions, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ludovic. Well, yes, working with science, bringing together representatives from the world of science, bringing together farmers, some MEPs. I see that we've been joined by my colleague, fellow farmer, Jérémy Dessel, who'll be saying a few words to wrap us up a bit later on. But there's something else that's very important as well. And really, this is one of the objectives of our intergroup, is to raise awareness with our colleagues from the Commission. And today I am delighted to be joined. It is online. Now, as it is online, it means that unfortunately interpretation will not be provided. We're joined by Emanuele Paolo from DG Clima. They are really at the helm of future EU climate policy, so it's very important to look them in on this. So let me now give the floor to Mr. Paolo. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone. I'll do my presentation in English, and thank you very much, Mr. Cassard, for the invitation. I really followed with interest the discussion so far. It was particularly interesting for me that at the European Commission in DG Clima, I'm working in a unit that is very much focusing on how we can address emissions from agriculture and from land use. It's the unit C3 that looks at land economy and carbon removals. Listening to all of you, I was reflecting on the fact that agriculture is really the only sector that has the potential to regenerate and not only to deplete natural resources. The intervention that we had from the professors and the science behind all of it that we have heard today made me reflect on the importance of the role that we have of having an approach that is holistic to agriculture and in particular to livestock due to its importance not only for the environment but also for nutrition, for health, for biodiversity. I don't think I need to repeat that here at DG Clima, of course, we look at emissions and how we can reduce them. And when we look at the footprint of agriculture in Europe, we are about at 12% the emissions from agriculture into the global mix. And of course, the livestock sector within the agriculture is very prominent because it accounts about 66% of emissions from agriculture. With a focus on methane that was very much mentioned today, but also nitrogen and ammonia. So from our perspective, addressing emissions from agriculture is vital, and we want to do so in a way that also takes into account the specific role that livestock has really at the cornerstone of the EU agriculture system, accounting for about also 40% of the added value in agriculture. In order to do so, we are focusing really on three things. So we do believe that from a climate perspective, we would need additional measures in order to support the transition of this sector and to foster farmers' adoption of climate mitigation solutions. So the second element is that we need to provide those incentives to the farmers in order to adopt those more sustainable farming practices. And then the third one, we need to foster innovation. We've heard today about many different types of innovation that are available, from feed additives to breeding. And this type of innovation is really what we want to foster. Here at DG Clima, we are thinking about a market-based voluntary mechanism that would create opportunity for farmers and for land managers in order to adopt more sustainable agricultural practices. We have put forward a legislation that entered into force at the end of 2024 that is called Carbon Removals and Carbon Farming Regulation. Without going into all the details about this legislation, the idea is to create voluntary incentives and leverage the opportunity coming from carbon markets in order to create an opportunity for farmers and land managers that would like to adopt practices that would reduce emissions from agriculture. We are looking at different types of carbon removals and emissions reductions in this space. And at this stage, we are very much working on the implementation of this legislation through specific methodologies that would look at really how we can quantify those carbon removals and emissions reductions generated in soils and potentially in the future also in livestock, and how we can do it in a practical way that would be that would not create additional burden for those that need to adopt those practices. In a nutshell, whatever is happening, focusing on really livestock, whatever is happening in extensive livestock farming is currently covered by the agriculture methodology, and we are very close to finalize through a delegated acts the agriculture methodology. So extensive livestock farming, carbon sequestration and reductions in grazing and grassland is already included into the agriculture methodology. And myself, I'm very much focusing on a second step. So it's the potential extension of the scope of the carbon removals and carbon farming regulation in order to include livestock emissions with a focus on enteric fermentation and manure management. So my message is we start from a recognition that I think it was an agreement today of the fact that we need to address emissions from agriculture. We would need additional measures to do so in order to achieve the objectives that we have, not only for climate, but equally for environment and economic. In order to trigger those additional measures, we need to support land managers with the right set of incentives, and that's what we want to do with CRCF, and equally create a monitoring, reporting, and verification system that actually works. On one end, to deliver on those climate mitigation objectives that we want to achieve, and then on the other hand, also to make it simple for those that need to implement those practices. And I would stop my intervention here, and I would be very happy to address any question if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paolo. Voilà, on arrive au terme parce qu'on n'aura pas beaucoup de temps pour les questions.
We will not have a huge amount of time for questions just now, but I would like to thank all 220 participants, attendees of our meeting today. I will now give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Goerens, followed by Mr. Dessel from Renew, certainly very sensitive to agricultural matters. Charles.
Question à poser.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Ludovic, Mr. Blanc. You talked about the issue of protein. You said that on your farm, you have been gradually replacing soya with protein that's been locally produced. Which protein is that? Is it clover? Is it peas? In my experience, farmers are extremely reluctant to give up on soy. Why is that in your view, and what ought to be done about it? And I've got a suggestion. I think that our group should look further into this matter because it is of key importance. We have this very significant dependency on protein from outside the EU. We are very far from being self-sufficient on this particular issue. I would like to hear from you on this, Mr. Blanc, if I may.
Que clairement, voilà, je réduis.
Yes, well, personally, I have been reducing what I import in terms of soy. I prefer to use rapeseed, mostly grown in France. But to be perfectly honest, there is simply not enough protein being produced in Europe. As things stand, sometimes it's economically more attractive to import soy rather than using rapeseed that's grown in France. So we need to be encouraging plant protein production in Europe.
Merci beaucoup, Loïc.
Thank you very much. Jérémy, do you have a few words to say on what you've heard here today as a Charolais beef farmer?
Faire même une mini conclusion.
Well, I won't attempt to conclude today. I arrived not long ago. I was speaking in the plenary on matters pertaining to agriculture, unfair trade practices. So I'd just like to begin by thanking you, Benoit, for having organized not just this meeting, but this series of meetings, this opportunity for exchange that are really a way for us to look at these issues more in depth, to continue to defend our farmers. They are the ones producing meat, dairy here in Europe. And it's really about ensuring that the technical means are there on a number of issues and to prove yet again how important, how rich the contribution is from our farmers to our continent in terms of the environment, in terms of our economy. European agriculture is a source of inspiration. That's certainly my view. And as I've said before, I really think that breeding, in particular livestock farming, is at the heart of our agriculture. And we need to keep working to try and stop those who are attempting to crush our livestock farming through dishonest methods. Because we're certainly there, we're hanging in there and working hard to defend our livestock farmers. And all of this needs to be done without losing sight of the fact that ruminants really have a unique contribution in terms of protecting our territories, our areas, our communities. Those who want to see a drop in livestock farming, well, we really need to make them understand that when you get rid of livestock farming, well, you will have lost out on that area. You will have lost out on an incalculable amount of wealth, both in literal and figurative terms. So that's all from me. Thank you very much, Benoit, once again. And my thanks too to those of you who attend these meetings regularly. That really is incredibly useful for us as MEPs in where it certainly feeds into, perhaps arsenal is not the right term, but it does give us the means that we need to take action and to ensure that we can weigh in on discussions and certainly hold sway in discussions. And looking at what's coming up with the upcoming agricultural policy, what's very important that we stand strongly and stand united. Thank you very much. And I too would like to thank in particular the scientific community. There are more and more of you. We have around 40 professors coming from all over Europe, participating directly or indirectly in our work. That's certainly very important. As things stand, science really needs to be given back the upper hand over emotion, and that really is the last message that I would convey today. We're working so hard to do things right here, and there's one solution that we must never contemplate. We must never stop farming here in Europe, only to turn to importing things that simply don't offer the same quality as what we have here. That is certainly something we should never do. We must make sure that we're working here to continue farming here. There is a natural harmony between plant protein, between animal protein, and we need to work to cultivate that harmony. And I'm very much looking forward to our next meeting to carry on with our work, bringing together scientists, people working on the ground, policymakers from the Commission. My thanks again to Mr. Sicuro, and MEPs as well, who are certainly joining us more and more as well. Thank you very much, and now it's time for us to go to the votes.